med dig. Gränlös huskraft, homo undurna. Thouas efter vista, warp upp a haven. Mitchell morgensvej.
It's early August, near the end of the 20th century. We're on the south bank of the Thames, in the borough of Southwark, just across from the heart of London, and just a few minutes' walk from the site where Shakespeare's Globe Theatre stood 400 years ago. This is the site. The first Globe burned to the ground in 1613. The second was pulled down in 1644 to make way for tenement housing. A third is about to be reconstructed. If we were to journey even further back in time, another few minutes' walk would take us to the site of the Tabard Inn, from which Chaucer's pilgrims began their journey to Canterbury 600 years ago. It burned in 1676. If we were to go on to the early 8th century, this entire area of Southwark would be mostly forest and marsh. London itself, for all its prominence during even earlier Celtic and Roman times, would have only just begun its recovery from the barbarized existence it had been leading for nearly 300 years of Saxon invasion. In a few hours, its inhabitants would be building their fires against the coming of darkness. And in a great hall somewhere to the north, that same darkness would be terrifying the first audience ever to hear Beowulf. In our journey back through time, we have just passed through the three stages into which linguistics divides the early history of the language. Going back from 1800 to 1500, we would have been moving through the early modern period. From 1500 to 1100, the Middle English period, and by the 8th century, we would have been in Old English. If we had gone on to 449 AD, we would have witnessed the arrival of the first Germanic invaders on the English shore, and we would have reached the earliest point at which any of their continental Germanic dialects could be called English. For in England, the language has not always been English. We do not know what the earliest languages were. The first which we can identify is Celtic, a distinct branch of the Indo-European language family. As distinct as Germanic, from which, among others, modern English and modern German derive, and as distinct as Italic, from which Latin and the modern Romance languages come. For 400 years after the Emperor Claudius's conquest of Celtic Britain in 43 AD, an Italic language, Latin, was prominent. Yet it never seems to have threatened Celtic as the dominant language of the people. But with the Germanic invasions beginning in 449, everything changed. The Celts and their language were driven far to the north and west. The voices of those invaders would sound as alien to us today as they sounded to the Celts 1,500 years ago, even though those voices are the ones which, over the centuries, were to change into our own. A modern speaker of English finds learning Old English, the earliest stage of his own language, nearly as difficult as learning Celtic, a language from a completely different branch of the Indo-European family. The opening lines of Beowulf, the greatest work in Old English, sound like this. Chwet we gardena in Jerdagum theod Könige thrumje frunan, who thy edelingas hellen fremmedan. A bit obscure, to say the least. Even early modern English, the language of Shakespeare, as near as it is to our own speech, nearer to some dialects than to others, would still sound strange to us. If we could go back to November 1st, 1611, and hear the voice of Prospero rising above the court of James I in what was perhaps the first performance of Shakespeare's Tempest, we might hear this. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. We didn't really need the subtitles. Shakespeare's pronunciation is close to our own, so is his vocabulary, so is his grammar. But Old English, the language of Beowulf, that's a different story. Much of its vocabulary is no longer in the language at all, and many of the words that have remained are so changed in form, pronunciation, or meaning that we no longer understand them. And even the syntax can be a problem. Sometimes word order is the same reliable structure signal it is in modern English. In fact, more often than not, but not always. We can be translating along, in Old English poetry especially, getting all the words correct, getting the definitions correct, only to realize that we really don't understand what it is we're translating. We don't know what words go with what words. We don't know who's doing what to whom. We've been using word order to answer these questions when we should have been using the forms of words, particularly their inflectional endings. When I was delivering the opening lines of Beowulf, the words in the subtitles were not being given in the same order in which I was delivering them. If the order had been the same, we would hardly have understood the subtitles at all, and what obscure meaning we would have gleaned from them would probably have been the wrong one. Middle English, at least in the London dialect of its greatest artist, Geoffrey Chaucer, falls somewhere between the almost complete understandability of Shakespeare's early modern and the almost complete obscurity of the Beowulf poet's Old English. Since leaving London, after Prospero's speech from the Tempest, we've been making our way toward Canterbury, the destination of Chaucer's pilgrims. The sample of Middle English I'm going to give you now is from the tale the Franklin told on the journey to the cathedral. Unlike the passage from Shakespeare, it does need the subtitles, but unlike the passage from Old English, it is partly understandable without them. For all things serious softly darit say, that friendes everich over moto by, if they will longer holden compagnia. Love will not be constrained be maestria. One maestri comes, the god of love anon, batteth his wings, and farewell he is gone. Love is a thing, as any spirit free. Woman of kind, desiring liberty, and not to be constrained as a thrall, and so don't men, if ye so say and shall. The main problem is the pronunciation, particularly the pronunciation of the long vowels. The long vowels of modern English are the result of such extensive changes since the Middle English period that they can cause real difficulties. For example, the personal pronoun I is pronounced in Middle English E, and when we pronounce it that way, it sounds far more like he than I. By the time we get to the early modern period, in the language of Shakespeare, E has already become I, and sounds like a version of whatever I we have in our own dialect. Chaucer's morphology, the grammatical forms of his words, is a bit more complicated than Shakespeare's, but like Shakespeare's, and unlike that of Old English, it causes no real difficulties, because word order, regardless of the forms of words, shows the relationships between words. Chaucer's vocabulary can be more of a problem than it is in this particular passage, but most of the words he uses we still use or at least recognize. We need a good glossary when we're reading Chaucer, and we need to refer to it more often than we do when reading Shakespeare. But we don't have to memorize word list after word list in language lesson after language lesson, as we must when approaching the Old English of Beowulf. We are overlooking the tidal estuary of the River Deben, near the town of Woodbridge, about 60 miles northeast of London and 50 miles north of Canterbury. Behind me is the site of the greatest archaeological find of the Old English period, the Sutton Hoo Ship Burial. In 1939, the largest of the several barrows or burial mounds on the site was opened. It revealed the remains of a ship whose overall length was 89 feet. The site had never been ransacked. Inside was a royal funeral deposit dating from 625 to 630 AD, approximately 100 years before the earliest date usually given to the composition of Beowulf. The burial was pagan. The ship was laden with treasure and with everyday utensils. Its bow was pointed away from the sea to bear its royal dead on a journey through the darkness of earth. Beowulf contains a description of a similar ship burial, although in the poem, the vessel is set adrift in the water instead of in the earth. Fair at húða stóð, hringit stefna, ísig und útfoss, æðlingas fair.
A leidon tha lefna fern, berga brutan on berm shippes, merna bemesta. Fair was madma fella, of fair wayum, fratwaya ladded, ne hirde ich kynlikor tjälje jirwan, hilda wapnum und hertho wadum, billum und burnum. Him on bermalai, madma maniga, tha him midskjolden, on flodes acht, fair juvitan. Tha it him aseton, seien gjeldena, herch over hervod, leiton holm beran, jervon on a rarsech. Him was jermorsefa, mornende mod. Men ne kunnon, sedjan tosoda, sela rädenda, härleth under hävnum, ha fem chlasta on feng.
Initially, to the modern listener, the most striking aspect of Beowulf is the sheer power of its sound. But beyond that power of sound, pure horror is at the heart of the poem's greatness. In fact, Beowulf is one of the greatest horror stories in English because it is one of the most profound. It's divided into 3 main episodes, each containing its hero's triumph over 3 separate monsters. But it is far more than the simple fantasy of a strong man defeating alien intruders. Intruders is the key word. The monster Grendel, his mother, and the final dragon are intruders in one sense. They come from the landscape outside human habitation. But in another sense, it is man who is the intruder. Man who has brought his civilization, his great halls, his art, his society, his rationality into the primal terror of their landscape. Man who burns fires at sundown in a desperate attempt to hold back the night and keep the day with all its reassuring categories and definitions. In the daylight, this is this, and that is that, and we, in the midst of a knowable world, know who and what we are. If things go wrong, there is illumination by which we can set them right. But the monster Grendel is from the dark.
He is a shadow yenga, a shadow walker, a mera merkstapper, a wanderer of the waste borderlands, an inhabitant of the Duurland, the secret land, the Wolfgredo, the wolf cliffs. His very nature walks the waste border between man and the beast. Tha se elengast fothlícha thraga tholada, se the in thustrum bad, that he dogere chwam, dream hirda, chlúdna in hela. There was herpen sway, swútol sang shoppers, seda se the kúða, frumskjeft fira, feran rechan, Quath at se almíchtige erdan workta. Ulit berg na wang swa water beboogeth, je setta sia gredig sunna, and monna, leamon to lechta lan boondum. On je fret wada voldan schetas, leamum and levum. Lief je scherp, kunne je hultjum, thare the quitsje hurfath, swa thadrich human, dreamum lifdon, diglitja, oth that an ongan, furna fremman theondon hella, was se grimme gast, grendel hatten. Mera merkstappa se moras heol, fen on fasten, fiffelkunes erd, ons hella where do de huila, siden him schuppen verschriefen hefta in keines kunna. Thana chwelm jourak, etja drichten, thas de he abel slår. Nee, je ver he thera vechter. Ac he hinna fer forbrak, metod for thumana man kunna fram. Thanan untudras ela on walkon, Ertenus and ulva and arkneas, swilcha I rantesta with hodde wunnon, lange thraga, he him thaslan forjeld. Grendel is war, the image of man's impulse, brodrum tobanan, to be a slayer of his brothers. In the bestiality of his body, in its savage, deformed echo of humanity, we can see his refusal to be human, his hunger to rip and rend and devour his brothers, who are the enemy simply because they are not himself. He is Anna with Alum, one against all. The society, the all which he hungers to destroy, is itself a warrior society. At the end of the 1st century, the Roman historian Tacitus characterized it with the term comitatus, a close supporting relationship between a lord and his retainers, based more on mutual respect than on subservience. The warrior defended his lord and fought his wars, and in return, his lord gave him treasure and security, a place to gather in the firelight with his brothers, safe from the dark of the landscape and the violent night of the human psyche, safe from other lords
and other retainers, in the imagery of the Beowulf poet, safe from Cain. Warriors feasted with their beloved lord and his other retainers and slaughtered those outside the circle. These two rituals are the basis of Germanic warrior society: the slaughter of the enemy on the fields of war and the feast with the Lord in his great hall. But Grendel gives allegiance to no one. He is at war with his own ultimate and final Lord, God himself. And he is committed to the slaughter of all his own Lord's retainers, all his own brothers. There can be no one to share the feast. Every man that quitcha hurvath, that moves with life, is the enemy. So the war and the celebration, the battle and the feast become one. In the dark of the night, Grendel enters the great hall to wage battle and to feast, to murder his brothers and to devour them.
Tha kom of Mora under misklädum Grendel gongan, Godes ura bär, mynte se manskala, manna kynnes, sumna besirwan in sella tham herrn. Våd under walknum. Rather afterthon, on fagna floor, fan treddada, erda urmod. Him of stod lia I likost lärt unfair. Tha his mod achlog. Mynte that heje dälda thona de koma. Atal arglatja, anröje hulches, lief with licha. Tha hima lumpen was wistfull away. Ne that se arglatja, ulen thorta. Ak heje feng rada, forman sida, slapenda rink. Slat unvernum. Bat ban lokan, blod edrum drank, syns nadum swelg. Såna häfta livjendes älja fermot, fet on folma.
In Grendel, the Beowulf poet sees ignoble warfare as cannibalism, the very opposite of the act in which Se Almichtiga, the Almighty, Eirthan Workta, created the world. But he still praises noble warfare. Grendel is killed by the heroic warrior Beowulf. His arm is torn off at the shoulder, and he flees dying under Fenachledo, under the Fen cliffs, seeking his runless reach, his joyless home beneath the water. After nearly 1,300 years of tragic history, we might be inclined to see Grendel as warfare itself, noble or ignoble, the very essence of the institution, and not simply its perversion. Consequently, we might be inclined to see in the poem a meaning different from the one its composer consciously intended. But however uncertain we may be about the poet's intentions, we can have no doubts about the power of his language, the language which is the dawn of English.